What I'd like to do now is have a look at at anger, to clearly define anger and how to deal with that anger. Anger is defined as a mental factor that sees its object as unattractive. It exaggerates the object's unattractiveness and then wishes to harm the object. Why? Because anger believes that object is the source of our suffering. So again, anger is a mental factor that sees its object as unattractive. It exaggerates the object's unattractiveness and then wishes to harm the object. So what we see in this definition, and also from yesterday the definition of attachment, and actually in general with mental afflictions, is this factor of exaggeration and distortion. And this, I think, is something commonly understood in psychology as well. In fact, I've got a quote here from a book from His Holiness Dalai Lama where he says, "Recently a psychotherapist told me that when we generate anger, 90% of the ugliness of the object of our anger is due to our own exaggeration. This is very much in conformity with the Buddhist idea of how mental afflictions arise." So generally, of course, we understand that anger is very harmful, destructive, and we want to get rid of it. But sometimes there's a few doubts, and one of them is, I actually don't want to get rid of anger fully, because actually sometimes I need anger. Sometimes I need anger to deal with difficult situations. Of course, no one is disputing the fact that anger is very forceful. But, as we've seen in the definition, anger exaggerates and distorts. Which means, and we know this from our own experience, particularly if we have very strong anger, we often overreact and react in an inappropriate way. So rather than actually resolving difficult situations, often anger just magnifies, makes them worse. So Buddhism says we don't need anger to deal with difficult situations. In fact, often you'll hear people say, instead of anger, practice patience. But then also people get some strange idea about what that means. And then often people feel that, okay, according to Buddhism, what I need to do then is just sit there and do nothing. This is not patience. Patience is not a behavior, at least how it's defined in Buddhism. Patience is a mental attitude. Patience in Buddhism is defined as an undisturbed mind in the face of a difficult situation. So what Buddhism is saying when we're faced with a difficult situation, when they say be patient, it means remain calm. And if we can do that, we can better evaluate what's really going on there rather than this exaggeration and distortion. And then we can better respond in a more effective way. What then is the strong force that we need to use to respond? Because sometimes we need a forceful response. And Buddha's answer is compassion. And again, here there's often a lot of confusion. And often we tend to feel as if anger is a sign of strength and compassion is actually a sign of weakness. Actually, it's the exact opposite. Anger is a sign of weakness because it means we can't effectively deal with a difficult situation without trying to dominate someone. So that's a sign of weakness. And compassion is a sign of strength. And remember, compassion is not an emotion. So compassion is not sitting there smiling and saying nice things. This is not compassion. Nothing to do with compassion. Compassion is an aspiration, it's a wish, it's a mental attitude. It's the wish for ourselves and others to be free of suffering and its causes. Which means if someone else is behaving badly, and we sit there, smile and say nice things and allow them to continue to behave badly, that's exact opposite to compassion. Because we're somehow encouraging them to behave badly. So therefore, if they're behaving badly, we need to help them to overcome that. And so of course, if they're using some physical force or something, or physically attacking us, we may need to use physical force to restrain that person. But of course, if anger gets in there, often we use excessive force and then the whole thing gets out of control. And I think here, like yesterday with attachment, some of the confusion comes around from the word itself. And again, I think here in psychology, sometimes this word anger is defined a little bit differently. In fact, recently I read a book written by a psychologist, and he was in this particular part of the book talking about anger, and he said, you Buddhists have got it completely wrong. He said, it's not, you shouldn't try to get rid of anger fully, but actually it's about having the right type of anger at the right time in the right amount. And he said, if you didn't have that, how would you deal with difficult situations like social injustice? And then it became very clear to me that what he meant by the word anger was very different than this. Because in Buddhism, anger always implies an intention to harm. Whereas I think there, he was using the word anger to even refer to very strong behavior, very strong responses. But a strong response is not necessarily anger. If we're doing a strong response, trying to help someone, that's compassion in Buddhism. So we need to be aware about that, clear about that. Then, why is it actually that we get angry with people who behave badly, particularly toward ourselves or someone close to us? And why is it that we find it so difficult to have compassion for that person? And I think there's a very simple answer. If we see someone behaving badly, the correct perspective would be to see and acknowledge there's a person doing some bad or harmful action or behavior. That's the correct perspective. But often when we see someone behaving badly, often we don't have this perspective. Rather, we have the perspective there's a bad person, there's an evil, horrible, nasty person. What we've done here is we've stuck the behavior to the person. We've fused them together, made them one thing. In psychology, this is called cognitive fusion. And this, of course, is a false, invalid perspective, because there are two things here. There's a person and their behavior, not one thing. If we do this cognitive fusion, we're in trouble. Because in any given situation, we've got two choices: accept, reject. And generally, if someone's behaving badly, we reject, as we should. But if we reject with cognitive fusion, that translates into attacking the person. Because actually, the thing we don't like is their behavior. But when we stick the behavior to the person, we end up directing it to the person, attacking the person. And if we understand attacking the person, getting angry the person is not beneficial, then the only other option left is accept. And so then, of course, if we do cognitive fusion, accept translates into accepting their bad behavior. Which, of course, also is not helpful. So attacking or accepting bad behavior is not helpful. And then, of course, what happens is that we end up with a fixed, biased... Then what happens is, of course, we end up with a fixed, biased view of that person. And then if that person happens to do something good, it's hard for us to acknowledge that, because bad people don't do good things. So if they do something good, we'll sort of brush it off and say, well, they didn't really mean to do that, they're just a bad person. So we can't see any of their good qualities. And then, of course, when it comes to compassion, it becomes almost impossible, because having compassion for a bad person feels like what we're saying, what you did is okay, I don't mind. Of course we should mind. So that's why it's almost impossible to have compassion if we do cognitive fusion, even to the point where we say they deserve to suffer because they're a bad person. So of course the simple solution to all of this is don't do cognitive fusion, because cognitive fusion is a false, invalid perspective. Rather, simply have the correct perspective and acknowledge there is a person doing a bad or harmful behavior. And then we can accept the person and reject their behavior. So accepting the person is compassion for the person, and rejecting their bad behavior is to address the bad behavior. Is not tolerate their bad behavior, be very firm about that, and help that person to overcome that negative behavior. And then, of course, we can end up with a balanced view of that person. We also do this with ourselves. If we do a negative action, instead of having the correct perspective and acknowledging I have just done some harmful thing, often we do this as well. Oh, I'm a bad person. And then, of course, we end up attacking ourselves, beating ourselves up. Low self-esteem and self-hatred. So low self-esteem, self-hatred comes from cognitive fusion. And then, of course, compassion becomes difficult because I'm just a bad person. I don't deserve compassion. And then, of course, guilt follows. And guilt comes from cognitive fusion. Because if we've done something harmful and we feel guilty, what are we focusing on? Bad me. Guilt is completely useless. It just paralyzes us and makes us feel bad. Whereas if we've done something harmful and we regret, what are we focusing on? The bad action. So regret comes from the correct perspective. Simply acknowledging I have done this bad behavior. Regretting the bad behavior, having compassion for ourselves and addressing our negative behavior and looking to overcome our negative behavior. So unfortunately, I think we've been programmed to think and speak in this way since we were this high. You know, how often do you see if a young child is misbehaving, the parent goes, bad girl, bad boy, disaster, absolute disaster. Of course the child goes, oh yeah, I'm just a bad person. And of course then low self-esteem, guilt and self-hatred follows. But then, that seems to be quite epidemic in our modern societies, low self-esteem and so forth. And unfortunately, some modern therapies to help overcome that go to the other extreme and say, oh, you're not a bad person because you're a good person. You're, in fact, a special person. disaster. Because if you tell a child they're special, they'll think, oh, yes, I am special. In fact, I'm better than everyone else. And so they become very egotistical, self-centered. And then, of course, when they see that they can't live up to this title of special, that will really just confirm to them that actually they're really a bad person. So they'll just crash to the other extreme. So, therefore, cognitive fusion on the positive side also is not useful. So, therefore, if someone else has done a good behavior, what we don't want to do is praise the person, because they'll just get a big head thinking they're special. Rather, have the correct perspective and praise the behavior. And that will encourage them to continue to do that good behavior. Similarly with ourselves, if we do something good, don't praise yourself. You just get a big head. Rather, praise your behavior. Acknowledge your positive behavior. So whether we're talking on the positive or negative, if we do cognitive fusion, we end up with a big mess. Big mess. Any questions about that?
When you meditated, and you said a lot of the times take to our hearts, how do we protect our hearts? Because I know about too many psychologists that died of heart attack or...
Yeah. So remember, the visualization was to dissolve the black smoke in the light. And the symbolism there is that that light is the purity of our mind. It's our inner wisdom. And it's our inner wisdom that mental afflictions and suffering. That is the vipassana, the antidote. So the symbolism is that we are dissolving mental afflictions and suffering in wisdom. But again, what we tend to do is cognitive fusion. So therefore, when we get the black smoke and we think, oh yeah, I'm a bad person, people take black smoke and hold on to it. Oh yeah, punish me, I'm a bad person, I deserve this. So of course this is not doing the practice, it's just another example of cognitive fusion. So if we don't do cognitive fusion and we do it correctly, then I think it can be very, very powerful. Because we're not taking it to punish ourselves. We're symbolizing, and the thing is, it's the wish to take that from the person with compassion. And it's the wish to give happiness, which is loving kindness. So this visualization is just strengthening loving kindness and compassion. And as long as we don't do the cognitive fusion, I think there's no danger. But as I mentioned, we need to do it in stages. And even when we start with friends, we need to start with friends with little problems, not the big problem. Because we're not capable, we'll get overwhelmed. So if we start with friends with little problems and then slowly move up and then to people we don't know well, if we do that, then we'll be able to do this at the big level. But of course, if we try and take on the biggest thing first, we haven't developed the capacity. So there's that as well. We should do it in a sequential way. Any other questions? Okay, let's now briefly look at how to deal with anger. So like yesterday with attachment, the first step is to have a clear understanding of what we mean by anger. So here anger, of course, is this intention to harm. And understanding that that always is not appropriate and not helpful. Because if we feel like sometimes it's useful, then of course we're not going to try to overcome it. So to understand what anger is and see how destructive it is, how it really causes suffering for ourselves and others. so that we really have the aspiration to be free of it. Then, like attachment yesterday, the next step is to cultivate mindfulness. Because even if we have a deep desire to eliminate anger, but we don't have mindfulness, then of course what's going to happen is some stimulus, something unpleasant's come, before we know it, we've reacted already. So we need to stop the reacting. We need to catch things before we react. We need to catch anger as it's starting to arise, before it overtakes our mind. If we don't have that mindfulness, then that anger will take over our mind, and then of course we're out of control, and about the only thing we can do at that point is get away from the situation before we react, before we say and do things that we are going to later regret. But of course the idea is to catch it before that point, and if we have mindfulness, we can. We'll notice something starting, maybe some tension in the body, bit of irritation in the mind. We go, oh, hang on, what's happening here? What's coming? And then we observe. And with attachment, the same. One thing effective is simply observe it. Because if we are observing anger as an object, as it arises in the mind, it can't take control of our mind, and it will simply arise a bit and pass. And then, of course, on top of that, we can apply antidotes, like we saw yesterday with the attachment. So, of course, again, on the wisdom side, we use the same antidotes of impermanence and emptiness as yesterday with attachment. Is that by seeing that object or person that is provoking the anger, by seeing that as changing moment by moment, then there's nothing for us to push against with the aversion to cause the anger. And then also at a deeper level, emptiness is then, if there's a person or thing that really looks very unattractive there, we're having this aversion, anger, where is the unattractiveness in the person? Where is the anger that's arising in the mind? Where is the me that is generating this anger? And so if we do this investigation, it would simply dissolve. So that's from the wisdom wing. And then, of course, on the compassion wing, then these qualities that we're cultivating, loving kindness and compassion, they are the antidotes, of course, to anger. And particularly avoiding this cognitive fusion, not identifying ourselves or others with behavior, is to distinguishing those two things. Any questions?
Yeah. What happens if you do the cognitive fusion when the behavior is repetitive? Sort of.
Well, then they're really a bad person. There's not just bad person, it's really bad person.
Well, you may not do it after the first time, but what happens after the 10th time?
Well, after the 10th time, instead of saying, there's a person doing a bad action, we're saying there's a person who has a very strong negative habit. Then there's not a problem. We can have, in fact, if we do this, we'll probably even have stronger compassion, because we'll see that that strong negative behavior is causing a lot of suffering for them and for the people around them. So if we really just think like that, like there's a person who's a very strong habit of cheating people, of abusing people. So again, if we use the word rapist or something like this, it's cognitive fusion. Then we're just going to attack them. We're going to attack them. And that's the sort of language used in the media. Terrorist, rapist, killer. I mean, this is all cognitive fusion. So no wonder we attack them and get angry at them and so forth. And then, of course, that's what we do in our judicial system. If someone's done a crime, you're guilty. And we punish people in our judicial system, usually. And punishing people in judicial system, studies show forget about compassion, it is a cost to society, a financial cost, because they reoffend. So punishing people, regardless of compassion, even forgetting about that, is a higher cost to society. So if you just want to reduce the cost to society, don't punish people, punish crimes. Punish crimes and try and rehabilitate the person. No guarantee we can, but that's going to be a better outcome than doing this. And it's going to be a lower financial cost to society. And then often, if you can rehabilitate the person, often these people who are rehabilitated go out and understand and try and help other people because they understand how crimes are really cause a lot of suffering. So this is, I think if we do this, then more likely a better outcome. So again, when we use words like judging, condemning, and so forth, this is all cognitive fusion. Way back from yesterday, we talked about mindfulness, and a lot of some modern mindfulness traditions talk about this non-judgmental awareness of whatever is arising in the present moment. Good, but unfortunately, people are doing this, which means then when they're non-judgmental, they don't evaluate, which means they often, mistakenly, people think, oh, I have to be non-judgmental. I have to allow everything is okay. This is a disaster. Non-judgmental means don't do cognitive fusion. Non-judgmental means evaluate. Evaluate behavior. It means don't judge the person, because that's cognitive fusion.
So how you address behavior?
With compassion and, of course, wisdom has to be always there. And of course, there's no book you can go to that says do this. Every situation is unique. But using wisdom and compassion, we evaluate and then we address. Sometimes we get it wrong and then we learn from that. That's the best possible thing. There's no guarantee that we'll get it right. But that is going to be better than this. This is just going to lead to more suffering.
But address is doing something, yeah?
Not always, because it could be like, for example, if someone is in a bit of a rage or something toward us, address might mean, the wisdom might say, okay, whatever I try and do now, say or do, it's just going to make it worse. So the wisdom, the address might be, okay, this person's completely out of control, I need to back out of here, let them calm down, and then later I'll come and talk to them.
Yeah, but you're talking about small problems, you know. Like we talk, like, give an example for like rapist.
Okay, I'll give you an example. There is some judicial systems in some countries that understand that this is a better approach than this. And in fact, I saw a BBC documentary about exactly this. They were in Norway, and there was a maximum security prison in Norway, rapists, killers, whatever. There were no bars on any windows. No one tried to escape. The guards and the inmates were friends because they were doing this. And they interviewed some of the people in the prison, and they said, basically, because they're being cared for. Of course, if someone is creating a lot of crime in society, we need to take them out of society. But then we need to try and rehabilitate them. Maybe we can't. If we can't, we keep them out of society for the rest of their life because they're a danger to themselves and others. We try and rehabilitate them if we can, then we can put them back in society. But if we do this, and statistics show this is a higher cost to society, they'll re-offend. So we're not talking about whether or not we should take them out of society. Yes, we need to take them out of society because they're a danger to themselves and others, but then we should try and do this rather than this. Good. Good. Sure.
Is this concept of fusion is a Buddhistic concept of your concept?
No, not my concept. Yeah, this word cognitive fusion is coming from psychology, but this idea is in Buddhism. You'll find it's a lot in Shantideva. He talks a lot about this, but you won't see this term.
They differentiate, I mean, judge a person separately from...
Well, judge, evaluate.
Evaluate a person differently than his deeds.
Well, you evaluate the behavior instead of judging the person. So this, you'll find a lot, particularly like in Shantideva's text, he has a lot of things like this in his text. You won't see this term, but he's talking about this, saying that he's basically saying, don't do this, do this. Yeah. Okay, time for a tea break. Come back half an hour, 3:45.